All right, so in today's session, we have with us Dr. Caldwell B. Esselstyn Jr. Dr. Esselstyn has published over 150 scientific papers, many of them focusing on how to prevent and reverse coronary artery disease via plant-based nutrition. He is the author of a New York Times best-selling book called Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease, which is one of our absolute favorite books about the true power of plant-based nutrition. His work has been featured in the documentary film Forks Over Knives. And in addition to his academic and professional exploits, Dr. Esselstyn won a gold medal as part of the U.S. rowing team in the 1956 Olympic Games. So thanks for being with us here today, Dr. Esselstyn.
Well, this is really, Cyrus, an absolute pleasure for me. And I think what you guys are doing is wonderful. And I'm pleased to try to add a few bits and pieces to it.
Fantastic. All right. Well, let's start at the top here. You have a very long and distinguished career as a physician. So can you give us an idea of the experience that you have working specifically with people with diabetes?
Well, actually, it's unusual where I find myself these days because, quite frankly, when I finished my residency, and it was in general surgery. And after I had a year at Fort Bragg in the Army, my next year was in Vietnam as a combat surgeon. And when I got back from Vietnam, I was asked to join the staff in the Department of General Surgery at a place called the Cleveland Clinic. And I was there as a surgeon for 31 years. And my primary responsibilities were largely as head of the section on thyroid and parathyroid surgery, and the chairman of the breast cancer task force. But it was probably halfway through my career, about 1980, 81, 82, I began to get increasingly disillusioned with the fact that for no matter how many women I was doing breast surgery, I was doing absolutely nothing for the next unsuspecting victim. And this led me to a bit of global research, and it was really quite striking that you could see that there were other cultures where breast cancer was 30 to 40 times less frequent than the United States. Like, for example, in Kenya. And my gracious, in rural Japan in the 1950s, breast cancer was very infrequently identified. And yet, as soon as the Japanese women would migrate to the United States for the second and third generation, they now had the same rate of breast cancer as their Caucasian counterpart. And even perhaps more compelling was cancer of the prostate. In the entire nation of Japan, in 1958, how many autopsy-proven deaths were there from cancer of the prostate? The entire nation, 18. Now that was one of the more mind-boggling public health figures I'd ever seen. By 1978, they were up to 137, which still pales in comparison to the 28,000 who will die of prostate cancer this year in this country. Well, somewhere along the line with this, I began to get increasingly doubtful that my bones would long be dust before I might get the answers between nutrition and cancer. Although in hindsight, I'm not sure that's not correct. But nevertheless, I decided at this point to look at the leading killer of women and men in Western civilization, which was cardiovascular disease. And in many of these cultures that we were looking at globally, cardiovascular disease was virtually non-existent. And the common denominator was they were all thriving on whole food, plant-based nutrition. So it was really rather exciting to think that maybe if we could get people to eat to save themselves from the leading killer of women and men in Western civilization, heart disease. If they were eating to save themselves from heart disease, they could probably save themselves greatly from the common Western cancers of breast, prostate, colon, and pancreatic, perhaps. So that was sort of the background. And I started a small study in 1985 of patients severely ill with heart disease who had failed their first or second bypass, they had failed their first or second angioplasty, or they were too sick for these procedures. And the goal was to try to see if we couldn't get them to eat plant-based nutrition, and was very exciting because not only did their symptoms begin to disappear, but we actually then carefully measured them, began to find that they were reversing their disease. And so that was really a little bit of a protracted way of giving you how I got into this. But after I guess what that was. After I retired from surgery, the research was just too exciting to relinquish. And so for the last 15 years, I've continued to really stay active in running the cardiovascular disease prevention and reversal program at the Cleveland Clinic Wellness Institute.
Okay, so let's talk about your landmark study. I believe it started in 1985. And what did this study show, and why is it so profound?
Well, I think what was exciting about it was that we had an opportunity to prove two things. One, that patients would follow this diet, and two, that it would be effective. And both of those came true. Now, the rock upon which this study was most likely to flounder was lack of patient compliance. And I was really a bit of a neophyte. I had no psychological training, but I decided that the mantra that I would use for these patients would actually be the same mantra that I had been using for my cancer patients, that I had learned years ago from a marvelous caring surgeon from the West Coast by the name of Bert Dunphy. And Bert used to say that patients with cancer are not afraid to suffer. Patients with cancer are not afraid to die. But patients with cancer are afraid of being abandoned by their physician or by their family. So when I started this program, I wanted to see each of these patients every 2 weeks in my office. So I could go over every morsel they ate, check their cholesterol, blood pressure, and weight. And it really was very exciting. And of the original 24, there were 6 within the first month and a half. I had no money for this study. So I released them back full-time to their expert cardiologists, and they became sort of my quasi-control group, if you were. But those 18 that stuck with us was really quite exciting to see. Not only that they're losing weight, their symptoms are disappearing, their blood pressure was normalizing, and their cholesterol was plummeting. And it was very exciting when we carefully measured them. We did angiograms on 12 of those 18. And 4 of those had dramatic angiographic reversal of the disease. And their angina was disappearing. It was really quite profound what was happening. So we wrote this up in the peer-reviewed scientific literature a number of times. And it was very, very hard for the cardiovascular community to accept this, although I must say about the same time, actually even several years before us, Dean Ornish had done the same thing on the West Coast, although we didn't know each other until we were each several years into our study. But the thing that made it challenging was the fact that the cardiovascular community felt that this was such a rather significant and profound nutritional change that how were they sure that this could ever be repeated? And that's what we were so excited about in July of 2014 in the Journal of Family Practice. This time we repeated it again with over 198 patients. And of those close to 200, we lost 2 to follow-up, which is why it's 198. Of those original patients, 198, there were 89.3, almost 90%, who were adherent to this type of lifestyle change, which is a very significant change for these people. And of those who made this significant change, over the next close to 4 years of follow-up, they had one patient who had a major cardiovascular event. He had a stroke, well, a mild stroke while he was in China, from which he recovered. But he was, while he was in China, he was misbehaving. So I guess you might even say that he was not in that group. But anyway, so 99.4% over the next close to 4 years had no further major events. On the other hand, those 21 who were not adherent had 62% had recurrent cardiac events. So it was very, very clearly demarcated how powerful it can be, because it wasn't a pill, it wasn't a procedure, it wasn't an operation. It was a lifestyle change, and really what it was making these patients aware of the power of nutritional literacy to be able to change their lives. Because what happens to these patients, they lose weight, they lose their hypertension, and if they're diabetic, you've really got to be on your toes, because on their morning glucose measurement, it starts to drop, and then that means they're going to have to start cutting back on their diabetic medications as well. And if they had high cholesterol, that's coming down as well. So it's really very exciting how something is as straightforward and safe and enduring and powerful as food. I mean, compared to the Pharmageddon that people are getting these days out of the pharmaceutical houses, just think how exciting it is to cure them with food that is delicious. Now, the challenge here, is how do you get these people to adhere? How do you get these people to comply? That's the challenge. And we've changed that a little bit in that, see, with the present group, about 85% of these patients were from outside of Cleveland. So I couldn't see them regularly. So we had to do this in one exposure. 1 5.5-hour intensive seminar is what we've been doing. And what we found during this seminar is that these patients are going to learn all about how they have created their disease and how they can become empowered as the locus of control to halt and reverse their disease. And everybody, in addition, gets a very hefty notebook. And in that notebook is a copy of every PowerPoint that I used during the seminar, several of our scientific articles, a 44-page handout with many additional recipes that add to the 240 in the 2 books that we provide. There's a marvelous hour-and-a-quarter presentation from Anne, who's had 30 years experience acquiring and preparing plant-based foods, dealing with reading, ingredients, travel, and restaurants. And then everybody receives a DVD of the entire seminar that I filmed from an earlier one. So should they go home and get forgetful or rusty, they can flip this on and get themselves back up to speed. Then we always have a presentation from 3 local or regional participants who've had a previous successful experience, share their story with those in attendance, who can then say to themselves, listen, if he or she can do this, I can do this. Then we have a delightful plant-based luncheon and an opportunity to answer everybody's questions, and then stay in touch as necessary through email or phone call. And I think that the reason we have this success rate of close to 90% is that we show the patient respect. How do you show a patient respect? You show the patient respect by giving them your time. Very few physicians were going to give patients 5.5 hours. And I should add, I usually call all these patients 10 days before they come. Why? Because in that phone call 10 days before the seminar, it gives me an opportunity to get my arms around their story, and at the same time, provide them an opportunity to ask questions of me, so that when they do come to the seminar, we have a strong platform from which we can all move forward.
This is really, really powerful stuff. And we should also, we've talked about this with several of the other summit presenters, but remind people that heart disease is the #1 killer of diabetics. So this work that you're doing is so important. And you talk about, in your book, Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease, you have a chapter called Moderation Kills. So moderation is something that's very trendy right now. Can you tell us what you mean when you say moderation kills?
Yeah, well, here's, I think you'll understand. When you look at heart disease, couple of points. Heart disease, in truth, is nothing more than a toothless paper tiger that need never, ever exist. And if it does exist, it need never, ever progress. Why? This is a completely benign foodborne illness. Yeah. Now, for example, in this nation, right now, we have built a billion-dollar health industry around an illness that does not even exist in half the planet. I mean, how shameful really is that? Now, coming back to your question originally was about
moderation.
Yeah. Here's why it doesn't work. All experts would agree that where this disease has its inception, its onset, is when we progressively injure the life jacket and the guardian of our blood vessel, which happens to be that delicate innermost lining, the endothelium, which manufactures that absolutely marvelous molecule of gas, nitric oxide, which is the salvation for all of our blood vessels. Why? Because it has these remarkable functions of one. It keeps all the cellular elements flowing in our bloodstream like Teflon rather than Velcro. Keeps things from getting sticky. Number two, nitric oxide is the strongest blood vessel dilator in the body. When you climb stairs, the arteries to your heart, the arteries to your legs, they widen, they dilate. That's nitric oxide. Number three, nitric oxide prevents the wall of your artery from becoming thick and stiff or inflamed, protects you from getting high blood pressure or hypertension. And number four, this is key, an adequate, safe amount of nitric oxide protects you from ever developing blockages or plaque. So here is the key. Everybody on the planet who has cardiovascular disease has their disease because they have now so sufficiently trashed and injured their endothelial capacity to make nitric oxide, they don't have enough to protect themselves. So now here's where this moderation nonsense, I think, gets knocked out of the park. If you have somebody, let's say, who's had a heart attack, right? Everybody has, by the way, triple vessel disease. No matter what the angiogram shows, everybody's got triple vessel disease. But let's say they've got one where they had a heart attack. The left anterior descending had a 98% blockage or occlusion, and the patient had a heart attack. Now they're stable, everything's going fine, they're no longer having pain, but they're walking around with this disease. Now, if you're in traditional cardiology, you'll give them some drugs, some medication, something for blood pressure, cholesterol-lowering drug, maybe an anti-clotting drug, some aspirin, none of which have anything whatsoever to do with the causation of the illness. So let's suppose that I get a patient who says to me, Dr. Esselstyn, you'd be proud of me. I'm following your program 85%. And I said, well, wait a minute. I don't know whose program you're talking about, but I don't have a program that's 85%. Well, but your program is pretty extreme and pretty radical. I said, no, wait a minute. When you say extreme or radical, would you say that to the Okinawans or the rural Chinese or those in Central Africa or the Tarahumara who have eaten this way for centuries and who never have heart disease? No, let's be clear about this. The most radical nutrition on the planet is the one that 97% of Americans are eating that guarantees that they're going to suffer from chronic illness, all right? But why? I'll ask this patient, why, with you who've had a heart attack? Now, do you understand the only reason you had a heart attack was that you so sufficiently trashed and injured your endothelial cells, you didn't have enough nitric oxide to protect yourself. And what you've been doing, telling me you've been doing is that you're still 15%, albeit, you're still hammering away trying to injure more of your endothelial cells. This is not a malignancy. These cells have an opportunity to recover. You're not giving them an opportunity to recover. Matter of fact, you're making them worse. You're trying to get a second heart attack. Makes no sense. That's my answer to moderation. And that is why I think we succeed, because when you have the patients that do this and do it right, their disease actually is history. And we think it takes about 3 weeks to restore enough of the endothelial cell that you cannot rupture your plaque.
Okay, so can you go into a little bit of detail here? You know, there's a lot of people who make the assumption that if they have heart disease, they have hypertension, or they have high cholesterol, that they're just a victim of bad genes. Does this statement have any validity?
Where are all those victims with bad genes in Okinawa? Where are all the victims with bad genes in rural China? Where are all the victims with bad genes in Central Africa or the Tarahumara? You know, come on, we all have different genes, and there are going to be some who will perish more rapidly than others if you're eating this horrible Western diet. But the nice thing about our studies of epigenetics and so forth is that when you start eating favorably, if you're not eating any food that's going to injure your endothelial cell, I don't care what your genes are, you're not going to have heart disease.
Okay, so are there specific foods in the standard American diet that you would feel comfortable pointing to and saying these foods are more likely to damage your endothelium than these other foods? What would those foods be?
Any oil, olive oil, corn oil, soybean oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil, coconut oil, palm oil, oil in a cracker, oil in a piece of bread, oil in a salad dressing. Oil injures the endothelial lining. Multiple studies, peer-reviewed science prove this. And anything with a mother or a face. Meat, fish, chicken, fowl, turkey, and anything that is dairy. Milk, cream, butter, cheese, ice cream and yogurt, and any excess of sugary foods, sugary drinks, any excesses, cookies, pies, cakes, stevia, agave, or excesses of maple syrup, molasses, and honey. And I don't like, for my patients who have newly diagnosed heart disease, I don't like them to have coffee with caffeine. Tea with caffeine, okay. Coffee or decaf, okay, but coffee with caffeine, no. Why? An Italian study, two groups, one drinking coffee with caffeine, the other decaf. And after they drank it, then they would measure, with a brachial artery tourniquet test, they would measure endothelial function. Then they switched groups. It was a group that previously was drinking decaf is now drinking coffee with caffeine. It is always a group drinking the coffee with caffeine that demonstrated endothelial dysfunction.
This is fascinating because you see these New York Times articles that say people who drink more caffeine live longer. People that drink more caffeine live healthier lives for a longer period of time. But what you're saying is the exact opposite, that if you're drinking coffee that contains caffeine or caffeinated coffee, that it actually impairs endothelial function and minimizes blood flow. So what exactly does it mean when you say it impairs your endothelial function? Is it just the production of nitric oxide?
Yeah, that's right. You're decreasing the production of nitric oxide.
And that happens in blood vessels only surrounding your heart, or does this happen in blood vessels all throughout your body?
Because what the brachial artery tourniquet test is, in response to a tourniquet that's on for 5 minutes, once they release the tourniquet, in somebody who otherwise has very healthy endothelial cells, there would be a 30% greater flow of 30% greater increase of nitric oxide than there was at baseline.
Very cool. Okay, so let's switch gears here a little bit. Let's talk about diabetes and insulin in particular. You know, in your knowledge of heart disease and in your knowledge of the interplay specifically between heart disease and diabetes, can you give some insight here into whether eating a low carbohydrate diet specifically to minimize your insulin use or to minimize your insulin production is an intelligent strategy or an unintelligent strategy?
Well, I can only speak for the fact that the diet that we use for these patients is a high complex carbohydrate diet. In other words, if you're going to eat all these wonderful green leafy vegetables, if you're going to have bok choy, Swiss chard, kale, collards, collard green, beet greens, mustard green, turnip greens, Napa cabbage, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower, cilantro, parsley, spinach, and arugula. Those are all wonderful, phytonutrient-rich, complex carbohydrates. They're not going to mess up your diabetes. They're going to fill you with phytonutrients, and it's really quite exciting. And you have those vegetables, and you have whole grains in addition, plus legumes. Boy, you've got the foundation of a solid diet. I mean, look at the Tarahumara. They're pretty. It was interesting when Bill Connor was down and studied 583 of the Tarahumara Indians. Not one case of obesity or overweight. Not one patient had hypertension. What do they eat? The three sisters: bean, corn, squash. No nutritional deficits. Interesting, fascinating. Yeah. But what we see on the whole food plant-based nutrition, we have to alert the diabetics when they start this. Then watch out, watch your insulin, watch your metformin, watch your diabetic medications, because as that blood sugar starts creeping down under 100, under 90, I don't want you to get a blood sugar that's too low, because you're getting cured.
Yeah, and it happens quickly, as you know.
Yeah.
So in the world of cholesterol metabolism now, cholesterol metabolism, I think, is a really highly misunderstood subject as well. So can you maybe give us an overview? Can you give our listeners an idea here of how to interpret their cholesterol? Because a lot of people go to the doctor and they get these numbers back, and it's difficult to understand what's the difference between total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides. So can you give our listeners just an idea here of what are some good numbers to shoot for, and what do these numbers actually mean?
Well, I don't think there's never been a number that caused heart disease. What causes heart disease is what is passing through your lips every day that is going to injure the ability of your delicate intra-arterial endothelial cells to make nitric oxide. It's when you diminish your nitric oxide. Now, there are plenty of people who are close to me that who, over the last 30 years, never get a cholesterol under 190 or 200. All right? They're never going to have heart disease. Why? Because they are never passing anything through their lips that is going to injure their endothelial cells. They eat carefully. It's just that their liver has a thermostat that decides that they need a type of cholesterol of 190, or that's the amount of production their liver is making. Now, every single one of us has a liver that's making cholesterol from the time that we were infants. And when does it really become problematic? We know, for instance, from autopsy studies, that if you look at the autopsy results of young women and men between the ages of 17 and 34 who have died of accidents, homicides, and suicides, coronary artery disease is now ubiquitous. Not enough for their cardiac events, because the cardiac events probably are not going to start until they're another 20 or 25 years later, late 40s, 50s, and so forth. With what? From a disease that they've had since they were teenagers. So when you graduate from high school in this country, you get a diploma, and you also get the foundation for heart disease. Now, what have they been? Many of those kids don't have cholesterols that are that high, but what have they been eating? All the wrong food. A classic example of, but there was a beloved television journalist who used to run Meet the Press by the name of Timothy Russert. Timothy Russert was just a marvelous person. And he had this wonderful program, Meet the Press, on Sundays. And one Saturday, he was working on his program when he had a cardiac arrest, heart attack, and they could not resuscitate him, and he died. And I can remember listening to the Larry King show when his cardiologist was saying to Larry King, I don't know what's happened. I had him on good drugs. His LDL cholesterol was about 70. Well, at the autopsy, they found that Tim Russert was just absolutely loaded with all kinds of plaques throughout his coronary arteries and his aorta. Now, in other words, you can beat down your cholesterol with a drug and get a very exciting number that you think is going to protect you, and then continue to eat horribly. The key thing is, for instance, how many statin drugs do you think the Okinawans take, or the rural Chinese, or the Central Africans? 0. How much heart disease do they have? 0. Except if you go to them in that Central Africa and you look at the tribesmen, the Maasai warrior, right? They're herdsmen. They live with these cattle that are grass-fed. They're eating meat, milk, and blood. And there was a physician in this country who was very excited about the fact that they were some sort of a marvelous exception. He was going to prove how grass-fed meat spared you from any heart disease. And so he went over to Africa and he autopsied 50 of the Maasai who had died. They were loaded with coronary artery disease, okay? There goes your grass-fed. You know, it's crazy. Meat is meat. And dairy is dairy.
Is it possible to have cholesterol values that are too low?
I suppose it's possible, but if you're asking me, have I ever seen it or have I heard of it, you could probably take enough drug that you could get yourself into trouble, but that would be pretty hard to do. I've really have I ever seen anybody with a cholesterol that's too low, especially if from the standpoint of eating in a healthy manner. I just don't think that's going to be a problem.
Got it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about LDL particle size. This is a very hot topic. Is it important for people to get a test done to assess their LDL particle size?
Is that what the Okinawans are doing? Is that what the real Chinese do? Maybe the Papua Highlanders are getting their LDL particle count. I never get those. The patients come in sometimes with them. I never get particle counts. Particle counts never gave you a heart attack. What gives you a heart attack is what's passing through your lips every day that you're eating that is going to injure the, and sorry guys to drive the point home, but that's the message you have to have. You don't have to spend a lot of money in the lab or lab tests. We're trying to get away from that. We want to get away from spending all this money on unnecessary tests. If they're eating whole food, plant-based nutrition and not injuring their endothelial cells, yeah, you don't need particle counts.
Okay, so I hate to ask you another question about tests, but I gotta ask it. So the coronary calcium scan.
Let's talk about it.
Is it okay? What do you say about that?
It's a screening exam that many patients are getting, and if they've got a calcium on their coronary arteries, they have coronary artery disease. But for the physician, the calcium score is a surrogate that tells us that that is a patient who has a certain number of non-calcified inflamed plaque. And I learned a very interesting thing about this from Bill Castelli. Bill Castelli was a physician who for many years was director of the world famous Framingham Heart Study outside of Boston. And Castelli said this, if somebody comes to you as a patient and they have got a high calcium score, but they truly get it right, and from that day on, for the next year, they're totally whole food, plant-based nutrition. They come back a year later, all right? And they get another scan and it's higher. Now, many unknowing cardiologists and patients will think, oh my God, I've worked so hard on this whole food, plant-based nutrition, my disease has gotten worse. Nonsense. Castelli said, that hasn't gotten worse. What has happened is this. All those previously non-calcified inflamed plaque in the patient who's eating this highly anti-inflammatory whole food plant-based nutrition diet, as those previously non-inflamed plaque, those previously non-calcified inflamed plaque lose their inflammation. The body wants to get in on the act, he says, and will dump in a little calcium to try to hasten along quelling this inflammatory response. And they're better, and actually the patients are better off because of what was an inflamed plaque with a potential to rupture now is no longer inflamed. And it's as if the calcification has sealed it and lessened the likelihood that it can never rupture.
That's very, very interesting. Thank you for talking on that one. So you already gave us your famous jingle about greens. Can you just review why are greens so important? Why are you such a huge proponent of greens, especially for people who have advanced heart disease?
Yeah, when I get somebody that comes in, they've got angina, they've got heart disease, they've got angiograms that confirm they're loaded with plaque. I really want to give them the absolute optimum I can. And so in addition to going through the whole food plant-based nutrition we've talked about, this is a little extra that I started in the last 5.5 years. And I say to the patient, look, if you were able to somehow get your head inside that artery that is so filled with that plaque, you would see it is an absolute cauldron of oxidative inflammation. Therefore, we need antioxidants. No, don't go down to the health food store and buy a jug of pills that says antioxidant, because it doesn't work and it's going to be probably harmful. You're going to get your antioxidants from food. All right, what food? Food that is high in what we call ORAC value, ORAC, oxygen radical absorptive capacity. So that means if you're having raspberries and blueberries and strawberries and blackberries on your old-fashioned oat cereal, terrific. But nothing can trump the antioxidant value of green leafy vegetables. Therefore, I ask these patients, now I tell them, look, this is where you know me as a bit of a taskmaster, but I'm told I'm not as mean as I look. And I need them to chew, never smoothies, never juicing. I want them to chew a green leafy vegetable roughly the size of their fist after it has been boiled in water 5.5 to 6 minutes. It's now nice and tender. Then they must anoint it with several drops of a delightful balsamic vinegar. Why? Because the acetic acid in the vinegar has been shown to restore the nitric oxide synthase enzyme contained within the endothelial cell that is responsible for making nitric oxide. And they're going to chew this alongside their breakfast cereal, again as a mid-morning snack, again with their luncheon sandwich, again mid-afternoon, again at dinner time, and I adore it when they have that evening snack of kale. What are they doing? All day long, they are basking and they are bathing that oxidative cauldron of inflammation with nature's most powerful antioxidants.
Okay.
And that is why literally with these patients with angina and chest pain, they do this and suddenly within days they see it being diminished and often it disappears. And I've got them hooked.
So this might seem overwhelming for some people listening, but I want to go back to your point that you made earlier about how
overwhelming. Actually, I would say on the other hand, I have seen patients break down in tears and rejoice when they suddenly realize that they themselves have been empowered to destroy and annihilate this disease that has been taking them out.
I'm with you 100%. But for those who are unfortunately overwhelmed and very attached to some of their foods, I just want to go back to your experience of.
No, wait right there. You're attached to their food. All right, let's talk about that for a minute. What you have to do is you have to explain to them that they produce the disease by destroying their endothelial cells, destroying their ability to make nitric oxide. I'll spend an hour sometimes in our 5.5 hour seminar, I'll spend an hour on that. Why? Because it's so essential. They understand the mechanism of how they produce this disease. Then, when anybody ever comes to me and says, well, Dr. Esselstyn, my goodness, I was at this place and that was all they had, or it was my wife's and my anniversary. I said, wait a minute. You love this woman so much that on your very anniversary, you wanted to go out and destroy more endothelial cells? Come on. Or that was all they had? What would happen if you miss a meal? Or you miss 2 meals? Or you miss a week of meals? What do your endothelial cells do? They rejoice.
This is great. People need to, we need to take this file so people can listen to that over and over again when they're having these cravings. But
anybody who understands the endothelial production of nitric oxide, and that's how they got their disease, I said, listen, if you got a brain in your head, you'll never, ever eat that bit of meat again. You don't want to injure. That's the way you succeed. That's why we have patients that get cured.
Yeah. This is a great display of why you have such a high compliance rate. I think people meet you, they come to the seminars, they hear this stuff, and I'm so glad that we can have you bring this to a larger audience. But let's talk about, I think another reason you experience compliance and a lot of the other physicians on this particularly low-fat plant-based diet have compliance is because the food tastes amazing. So why don't you talk a little bit about what type of meals you're talking about that people eat on this diet?
Well, I think that the exciting thing for patients who are starting this, you have to reassure them they're not going to get any new, strange, unheard of food. It's going to be food that they've known all their life. We are going to ask them then to relinquish eating the foods that every time they pass their lips, they absolutely destroy and decimate their endothelial cell capacity to make nitric oxide. But we now have, between all the books that are out there by multiple authors now, that there are these delightful combinations of recipes. For instance, my own breakfast, I love it so much I'll share it with you. If I like those old-fashioned Quaker oats, you just pour them in a bowl. I don't like them cooked. I just eat them like a dry cereal. Then I add oat milk, all right? But I've added some bananas and raisins. And then I'll always have all, believe it or not, all four of these. I'll have blackberries, blueberries, strawberries, and raspberries. These berries are so powerful with antioxidants as well. You're having that's an absolute feast. And it's got many calories because some people who are eating this way find that they may lose a little more weight than they want. But when you have a breakfast bowl like I'm talking, there's plenty of calories there. Lunchtime in the wintertime, Anne makes these wonderful soups, just absolutely filled. Matter of fact, her soups are so thick you could walk on them. None of this watery stuff that doesn't have any body to it. And in addition, I'll usually then have a whole wheat bagel with that. Not too big a lunch. And at supper time, a favorite would be, let's say, brown rice, and then beans on top of that. And on top of that, some scallions, maybe some corn, some peas, cut up tomatoes, and cut up water chestnuts. And I mean, there's an absolute, really phytonutrient feast. Or if we don't have that, we'll have salads, but they're just loaded with many of the same vegetables. And then perhaps some food for dessert. Yeah, right.
Okay, so while we're talking about dietary nuances, and for people who have, advanced heart disease, you're well known for really limiting their fat consumption, and that includes nuts and seeds. So can you talk about that a little bit and just talk about how people can make sure they get enough essential fatty acids on a very low-fat diet?
Yeah, well, I think this is not meant, never intended to be a very low-fat diet. It happens to be somewhere around 10.5 to 11.5%. Really low-fat diet is like the Japanese soldiers in World War II, but we're down at 3.5%. But at 11%, really, that's what it works out to be. And there are no fatty deficiencies that I'm aware of. For instance, the only really essential fatty acids we have are omega-3 and omega-6. You'll never be deficient in omega-6. If you're worried about omega-3, we certainly encourage patients to use maybe a tablespoon or two of either flaxseed meal or chia seeds on their cereal, okay? Now, as far as really if somebody with heart disease trying to feast on a lot of seeds or nuts, I'm a little bit cautious there because when I first started this back in 1985, it was interesting that if you looked at the literature of experimental coronary artery disease, what investigators were doing to produce this disease in rodents and in rabbits was they were giving them peanut oil. And although there have been a number of studies, often supported by the nut companies, that are very supportive of what can happen in a positive direction of biomarkers with nuts, what I have yet to see is a group of patients seriously ill with advanced cardiovascular disease, where they are fed peanut butter and nuts and all these cashew sauces and have their disease melt away. I just haven't seen that yet. So I'm just very, very hesitant, very cautious about that. And I cannot see how in any way that I have deprived my patients of any of their chances for success by asking them to not eat the saturated fat and nuts. For instance, how many people do you know who will eat one nut? If I ever say that you can have nuts, they're in the glove compartment, they're in the kitchen, they're in the bathroom, they're in the hallway, they're in the bedroom, they're in the living room. Nuts are really highly addicting. So for patients that don't have heart disease, I don't have that restriction on avocado and nuts. But if you have heart disease, then I'm a little restricted on nuts.
This is terrific.
About the chia seeds and the yeah.
This is great. Okay, so if you could give us a 60-second elevator pitch of Dr. Esselstyn's dietary recommendations, feel free to put in a jingle, song and dance, whatever you want. What would that 60-second elevator pitch be?
Well, is this a sort of a summary?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I usually summarize by saying that we have at our fingertips right now in medicine the greatest tool that we've ever had in our toolbox. We can absolutely get rid of 80% of chronic illness. I mean, you're going to do it not with a procedure, not with a pill, not with an operation. We're going to get rid of the 80% of chronic disease with food, whole food, plant-based nutrition, which can absolutely, totally get rid of not only heart disease and diabetes and hypertension and strokes and vascular dementia, but ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, multiple sclerosis, asthma, allergies. Doing it with what? Not with some expensive drug that is going to make your hair fall out. No, that'll actually be with food. And it is safe, it is prompt, it is powerful, and it endures. Because if we are going to really turn this business about this crippling health bill that this nation has, if we're going to turn it around with the seismic revolution, that revolution is going to be when we in the medical profession have the will and the grit and the determination to share with the public what is not only the lifestyle, but most specifically, the nutritional literacy that will protect them from having chronic illness.
This is great. I wanted to personally thank you for all the, many, many, many years of work that you've done in research and, advocacy, getting out there and actually speaking with people and really driving home the point here that, like you said, the most powerful tool that physicians have at their disposal and the most powerful tool that people have at their disposal is the food that they put into their mouth. It's such a simple and such a powerful concept that I love hearing you say it every single time, and it never gets old. So thank you so much for your time and for all that you do.
Well, look at Robbie and Cyrus. That was just a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. And let's just let people know where they can find you. So your book, Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease, they can get that anywhere. Your wife and daughter have a cookbook, Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease cookbook. And you do speaking engagements, right?
Yeah, I work at the Cleveland Clinic Wellness Institute. Yeah, and that's where they can usually find me. Yeah.
Terrific. Okay, we'll have your website linked up. And again, really appreciate your time. Thank you.